And I can see Erin as well, which is wonderful. So it's my great pleasure to thank Martin for gathering us all again for another monthly OASIS talk. And so nice to see a friendly face in Erin on the screen. And we're so delighted that she's agreed to come back and speak to us. We still talk about you a lot at St Cuthbert's, Erin, and remember you and particularly your flatmates, not just at the art festival, but also at the quiz night as well, and all the rest. So I'll hand over to Martin, who's going to sort of just welcome us in the capacity as OASIS. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Peter. Well, welcome to Erin and welcome to everybody. It's a joy to have Erin on. Well, we know Erin as our art intern who did a huge amount of work to get the art exhibition up and running. And as you've heard me say before, we ended up with some 600 exhibits, some 200 exhibitors and 900 visitors. And the very good administration and communication, much of that was done by Erin in the lead in through September and October. So Erin, we're delighted to have you as our guest speaker today. You're going to speak about student life, and you very kindly shared with me some PowerPoint slides that you're going to show just to help us through the conversation. And as you can imagine, with Erin only being partway through her university art college coursework, she's had to suffer the impact of the pandemic and all the stop-starts of lectures and so on. So we will hear what student life is like from Erin. And Erin, with your permission, we are recording your talk because a lot of people who can't join us lunchtime do listen at a time more convenient for themselves. And at the end of it, roughly at 1 o'clock, we would invite you to take a few questions. So that said, Erin, a very warm welcome to you. Lovely to see you again. And we look forward to you now telling us about student life under the era of the coronavirus. Thank you. Thank you, Erin.
So, hi, I'm Erin. I'm a second year fine arts student at Edinburgh University. So I study at UCA, and I'm going to be talking today about university life, the past 2 years, kind of throughout the pandemic, and the impact it's had on my education, and kind of just a different experience as a whole. So would you mind going on to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so it all started kind of, obviously, as everyone knows, March 2020, everything went a bit uncertain. So for me personally, I was studying my A-levels at the time, and it all kind of came to a halt very quickly. There was a lot of uncertainty for everyone about what would happen for their grades. We didn't know what was happening. No one really knew what was happening. So it was all quite up in the air. And luckily, I wasn't massively impacted by the whole system for the grading. So only one of my grades got downgraded. But I know lots of people missed out on university spaces because of the education system. And obviously, you have the whole question surrounding class divide. That's a whole other thing. But for everyone, I'd say it was just a very uncertain time for our education, and you're transitioning to university as well, obviously, not knowing quite what's going to happen. We weren't sure whether we'd actually get to university in September, how the teaching would be like, and there wasn't much communication between the time of March and September. So obviously everyone was impacted quite a lot by this phase. Would you mind going on to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so come September, I started at Edinburgh University. It was a very different experience to what you might expect from a university experience. Obviously, it couldn't be helped. We were living in very uncertain times, but it was very isolating, I'd say, to come. You've moved to a new city. I'd moved from London to Edinburgh. I didn't know anyone, and obviously the university had to have restrictions, but it was all very, it was a weird time to be in a new city, living with new people, but also not being allowed to socialise. So for instance, I lived in a flat of 10 people. We weren't allowed to socialise with more than 6 people, so we got told off for being in a room of 10 people despite us all living together. So it was all very uncertain. As you can see, obviously lots of people had to self-isolate inevitably, including me, including lots of people in halls, and the whole system was all a bit, the university was quite unsure as to what they were doing, and you can't blame them obviously, but it was all quite uncertain, as like there were lots of news articles came out about Edinburgh University and their treatment of the students, so like self-isolation, we weren't getting food delivered on time, and of course you've moved to another city and you're sitting in your room for 6 hours a day doing your work, so we didn't have any in-person welcome events, so it wasn't your typical freshers week meeting new people. You were just kind of confined to your halls, confined to your room. So it was obviously a very different experience from the expectation of starting university and not knowing any people or many people at all. So that was the start of it. Would you mind going on to the next slide, please? Thank you. And I just wanted to say a bit about doing a practical degree online as well. So I study art, obviously, and with paying 9,000 a year, you expect certain things from a university. So expect a studio space, workshops, tutors. Obviously, inevitably, that wasn't available last year. So we were stuck doing our whole degree online in our rooms. And for a practical degree, obviously, this isn't quite, it doesn't work necessarily. Again, you can't blame the university because it was kind of inevitable, but doing everything online when your room becomes your studio and the place where you eat, sleep, do your other work, it was quite an interesting experience, to say the least. So obviously there were pros and cons to doing your work online, so it gave you more flexibility, but obviously there was less contact, or if any contact at all, so it could be quite demotivating in a way to be sitting in your room not having quite the structure that you would from a normal university routine, as lectures were also pre-recorded. We didn't have that sort of contact time with our tutors. So for instance, I had 2.5 hours online every Monday, and that was my studio time for art, and the rest of the week I didn't have anything with my art tutors. Again, the university was trying to navigate this. They were doing the best they could given the situation. The tutors were all really helpful. It just wasn't the situation you would necessarily expect, and there are limitations to doing a practical degree online. So for instance, not being allowed to go into the studios or use certain materials, your work becomes very limited to doing 2D paperwork. So I have like a couple of examples of my work from last year on the left. It was all very small work. I didn't have the opportunity to branch out necessarily as much as I would have. So for the first year of an art degree, it's normally centered around experimenting, using new materials, getting to use the workshops, and there was absolutely none of that for us, unfortunately. Out of the university's control, out of our control. So it was quite limiting in a way, and you really did just have to make do with what you had. And some people were obviously more of an advantage than others. Again, because obviously you have to buy your own materials as well if you can't access the studios. And yeah, I'd say there was definitely like an advantage for certain people from certain backgrounds, yet again, because of online learning. So none of it was massively practical in a way, that we didn't have much contact time or space to create our work, unfortunately, because you're sitting in a small dorm room for 8 hours of the day trying to do everything in there. It doesn't quite work in a way. Would you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. And then coming on to the university itself's approach to dealing with the pandemic. Obviously last year there were quite a few protests and talks discussing like rent, the quality of teaching, and the university did respond to that. So there were lots of protests and rent strikes going across the whole of the UK as well, actually. And Edinburgh's response was more or less the fact that they were trying the best that they could, which I do understand. Given the situation, there's only so much you can do. But from living in that situation, being in the halls for a year, stuck, locked inside, it didn't necessarily feel like we had the support we were supposed to have. That's just my personal experience. But they did implement some sanctions. So, like, for instance, it was easy to get special circumstances. You could get extensions without having to justify it. So they were sympathetic, at least, and you were allowed to leave your rent clause without, like, you didn't have to pay a fine if you wanted to move out. So they did give us some options, but it wasn't necessarily what we needed, and it didn't feel like there was much of a response. And as well, obviously last year there were many discussions surrounding mental health of students and like the quality of teaching, obviously all being online. I don't have much of an experience myself with the student support services, so I can't speak for everyone, but it didn't seem that Edinburgh seemed to live up to its expectations of giving this support to students. Again, they are dealing with thousands of students, but I know it wasn't quite as much as they needed for thousands of students living through a pandemic. So yeah, the response from the university was obviously quite mixed, and again, they had to live by restrictions. We all did. It was necessary. It's just the way that the university treated their students, which maybe wasn't the right way to go around. It did feel quite policed, coming from my experience, especially living in halls as well. Everything was very monitored. So we did have people patrolling up and down the corridors to make sure that there was like only one person in a room. Necessary, obviously, when it's the law, but it's not somewhere you'd necessarily want to live or somewhere you'd feel comfortable living. So there could have been another way around it, but that's just from my experience. Obviously, I can't speak for everyone. The university just did take it certain approaches. Would you mind going to the next slide, please? And then obviously coming to this year, we've had a lot more in person, which has been nice. So I've managed to get my own studio space, as you can see in the image below. I've got my own desk for the year, and it's very welcomed to be in person this year, especially having the whole of last year online. It's nice to see everyone else's work and to all be together in a space, having in-person teaching. We do still have aspects of online teaching, so all my lectures are still online and exams are online, but I assume come the future those will go back into person. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more opportunities this year for students to socialise and collaborate. So we have exhibitions going on now in the university. So for instance, the two images are from the second year exhibition 2 weeks ago, which was nice to just have everyone's work in one space, especially being online for the whole of last year, where you didn't have the opportunity to see anyone else's work, which would become quite demotivating. Now you can just go into the studios and see what other people are making, and it definitely is a lot more motivating. And you can also use the facilities once again. So we have access to printing workshops, woodworking, photography, and those were all not available last year. There is still the continued use of precautionary measures. So obviously distancing is still taking place, mask wearing, but compared to last year, there's definitely been a shift, and it seems like the university is listening more to our needs of being in person, especially paying 9,000 a year. International students pay up to 20,000 a year, so you do need to get something out of it, I feel. And definitely, obviously, doing a practical degree, doing a creative degree, you need that contact with your tutors, with other students, and being back in the studios is very welcomed. So that's what's going on this year in comparison to last year. So that's kind of an overview of the whole experience I've had so far in my year and a half of being at Edinburgh University. Yeah.
Thank you, Erin. That's can I stop showing the slides now?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, and we can go to the general discussion. So I shall stop the slides, and we should be back in business in just a moment. Stop share. There you are. So I invite questions for people, and Peter's put his hand up right away. So why not?
No, I throughout everything you were saying, I was left with that image of, I think you put up in slide 1 of the dining room, because where it looked like an examination hall. You were all sitting individually.
Yeah.
And can you just talk about what it was like to eat like that?
Yeah, it was quite a shock, because obviously going into catered accommodation, you are paying more money, and the reason why I personally went to catered accommodation is for the social aspect, to meet new people. You're all eating together, and then suddenly coming to university, you're sitting on a little desk 2 meters away from everyone else. It does feel very isolating, because obviously, like, that's a whole communal, to have like food together, it's supposed to be a communal thing, and to sit by yourself on your little desk, it was a very weird feeling. It wasn't very welcomed by anyone. Obviously I understand stuff like that's necessary, but you are generally going for dinner with people you live with anyway, so they could have approached it a bit better, because it did just feel it just added to the whole feeling of isolation, and it was quite comical in a way to just be sitting on a little exam desk eating your breakfast. Yeah, I think they've changed it this year though, so.
Okay, thank you.
Any general questions from people? I'll ask one just while people are thinking. Erin, you obviously mentioned the isolation, and that brings a certain amount of mental pressures, and yet we know you as a positive type of person, outgoing and cheerful, when we've seen you on a good number of occasions now. So how did you manage to survive the isolation, eating on your own, living in your dorm room for 8 hours a day? How did you manage to cope with all that and come out with a reasonably positive outlook? Did you have any particular ways of dealing with it?
I mean, by the point of September, at least, we'd all been through isolation for a good couple months. It wasn't anything like, you weren't suddenly alone, like we had gone a few months into the pandemic at least. I think looking back on it now, it wasn't necessarily the best experience for anyone really. But I guess in the moment you do just kind of have to get on with it in a way. That's what I found, at least. It definitely does take a toll on people though, to obviously, I think the biggest part as well is moving to a new city where you don't know anyone, and then suddenly you're just thrown in by yourself, because the whole point of university is to meet new people, learn new things, go around the city, and when obviously lots of stuff was shut, that wasn't possible. So yeah, it's kind of just making up for lost time this year really. So
yes, well, we congratulate you on coming out positively and coping, because clearly it was not easy, and not least because it was very prolonged. I've got a couple other questions, but I want to go to Jim first, because Jim, you put up your electronic hand a moment ago. So Jim, over to you.
Yes, I did. Yes. Yes, my question is, do you think there would be any value in a kind of post-mortem by the university about what worked and what didn't work? Because this could happen again.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to think what they've already done. There hasn't, I think from last year, they've definitely learned this year to tackle it in a different approach, but obviously there are less restrictions. I think the biggest part for me though was the whole living in halls experience. That was definitely the most affected, and obviously this year they've lowered the restrictions, but it would be very helpful for them to actually look back on the way that they dealt with everything and perhaps what could have been done better, because I know lots of people did struggle last year a lot, and the university's treatment wasn't quite the best.
So is there a student body making that suggestion to the university?
To my knowledge, yes, there have been quite a few
Oh, good.
prompts forward, but there's only so much the university can do. Obviously, it was a universal experience last year, not just for Edinburgh Uni students, but for
Sure.
students all across the UK. So it depends what they come out with, really. But I do know they're not planning on refunding any fees or anything. So
They've got the cash and they're going to keep it, Erin.
yeah.
Thank you for your question, Jim. Other questions? John's got his hand up. John, please.
Good afternoon, Erin. I think we met briefly at the art exhibition. I was just wondering, as an amateur poet, do you feel that the artwork you've produced perhaps has a darker, more somber theme because of your experiences of being effectively locked up without anybody to speak to, as opposed to getting out and about in the fresh air and so on?
Yeah, I mean, speaking honestly, I think my artwork last year was very demotivated. I wasn't making that much work because I wasn't seeing anyone else's work. You don't have that kind of communication with other people who do art. So obviously my flat, we weren't all doing art, lots of people were doing different subjects. So you don't have that conversation with people about your work, which does become quite demotivating. So I think definitely looking at my work this year, coming from or being indoors doing your work in your room to now I have access to the studios, I've been making a lot more like bigger work. So for instance, my last work I made was all to do with like social stuff, which has been nice to have that kind of contrast, but I can definitely see how my work last year and throughout the pandemic definitely wasn't the standard I necessarily would have liked, or the style I would have necessarily chose, just because I didn't have that sort of push forward.
Thank you for the question and the answer there, Erin. Other questions, please. Maggie, I know you're normally very good at coming up with questions, so this is a natural opportunity for you.
I was at Edinburgh University a long time ago, and I lived at home. But the bit that I loved about uni was the fact of getting to know so many people from so many different places and all doing different courses. And for me, I just loved that aspect of it. It makes me sound like as if I spent all my time socializing at university and not doing any work, but it was great. It was a real eye-opener to me, you know, just meeting people. And I wonder, you know, how Erin, she must feel rather cheated in a way that she was deprived of that. And so is she now managing to socialize more? And that's what I'd like to ask her. Yeah.
Thank you, Maggie. Erin.
I mean, obviously, in a way, we are quite lucky to have social media throughout last year to keep in contact with people. But obviously, it wasn't quite the experience you'd want regarding meeting new people. There wasn't much opportunity because you weren't going in person to lectures or to the studios. So you did kind of have to put yourself out there if you wanted to meet people. Obviously, with very limited things to do, or with the restrictions, it wasn't quite possible. So I do think this year it has been better, but it's definitely, well, it was not a conventional start to university, to say the least.
Yeah.
And I think it has definitely, in a way, the way that people regard like socializing now, it definitely has impacted on it. I do find as well, everyone is kind of like still in a bubble. There's not quite the aspect of what you'd expect of going out and meeting new people all the time. So it is definitely just a very different experience, and it's not what I generally expected of university, say 5 years ago when I'd imagined going to university. Obviously no one could anticipate what would happen. But yeah, the experience was quite different. And yeah.
I was going to ask, so looking back, do you wish you had waited a year before you came up to Edinburgh? And having met you and your flatmates, it seems like you've done incredibly well to, make good friends. And obviously what we saw of you in the art exhibition shows that, you still managed to keep motivated and really engage with all the opportunities. But do you now look back and think, well, maybe I should have waited a year, or do you wish you had?
Yeah, I do think about that quite a lot, actually, because I was considering it back in July 2020 whether to defer a year, because you never quite know what's going to happen, really. And obviously doing art, the conventional route for an art degree is to take an art foundation and then go on and do your degree. I didn't do a foundation, I went straight into degree. So there was always that thought being like, oh, should I have gone and done a foundation and stayed in London? Then I could have gone the next year. But I do think there were definitely benefits of going last year. And I'm quite lucky in a sense, personally, that my degree is 5 years long. So I still do, after this year, I still will have 3 years, which is the conventional length of a degree. So I do kind of have like 2 practice years. But obviously I know quite a few of my friends, they're in their second year now, and next year is their final year at university, so they have had not the best experience, and they do wish that they'd waited a year just to get the full 3-year experience, because last year was quite a write-off year in a way. But no, I'm happy that I did go last year, because I think it has opened up many opportunities. And I did just get quite lucky in the people I was with and the people that I did meet. But I can't say the same for everyone, because I do know people who wish they did defer.
Well, of course, Erin, because you have a positive outlook in life, in spite of all the problems associated with the pandemic, you ended up very much as our art intern. And that, of course, gave you a chance to meet a lot of people that you wouldn't have met. You might, because many ways the people on the call are the people who supported behind the scenes and made the art exhibition happen, long before we met you and so on. Did it help you at all, to overcome some of the feelings that you got heavily involved in the art exhibition? Did that give you a positive experience?
Yeah, it was such a good experience. I think definitely going from, so obviously the art intern job was throughout the start of my second year, so it was really nice to kind of have something that made me feel more engaged as well within the Edinburgh community, because being online the whole of last year, there wasn't much scope to actually feel part of Edinburgh in a way as a city. So doing the art internship back in September was really nice to just kind of get to know Edinburgh a bit more and the people within it. And yeah, that was definitely very beneficial as well to my art practice. Definitely very motivating. But yeah.
Thank you for those comments. And as you know, and you've heard us say, it was a positive experience for us having you very much part of our team. And of course, one of the things we enjoyed enormously about the art exhibition is one of the few things as church organizers, we were able to cross the generation divide, by which I mean we had every generation represented. And on that theme, something for you to think about, but you may well wish to put on your own art exhibition, and perhaps a few of your peer group at St. Cuthbert's at some time In the not too distant future, I would hope. Remembering we get some 14,000 visitors in a non-COVID year, particularly in July and August, of course. So do think about exhibiting. And I don't think all the pieces of art have to be complete and brilliant, because in your presentation, you talked about using a lot of different materials.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned photography. So, you know, there's a whole way of exhibiting. But anyway, the invitation is open to you and your peer group. My question mentioning peer group is, did any of them drop out because of the pressures that you mentioned during your slide presentation? Did they drop out of university?
Yeah, I do know quite a few people who did drop out last year, and especially lots of people ended up moving back home in their first year. I didn't do that personally because I wanted as much of an experience as I could get, even if it wasn't a lockdown. But I do know lots of my friends did end up just going back home for first year and completing it online, which again has pros and cons to it. But it's not quite the university experience anyone would imagine, sitting in their childhood bedroom, really. But yeah, it was definitely a weird time for everyone.
Mm. And last question, Ray, then we'll go back to the general team. A subject you didn't touch on, but you might wish to make a comment. It would inevitably be an opinion. We hear a lot in the press about students being very concerned about what we call in our generation free speech. So the concept of free speech is anyone should be able to say anything. You don't have to agree with them. But the way we thought we would educate ourselves is hearing different views on all sorts of issues ranging from politics, religion to sport, social, whatever. In your part of Edinburgh University, I know there's a huge number of you, have you seen students being particularly fussy about visiting speakers or lecturers and their background and these sort of things? Has any of that impacted on you?
Personally, coming from the art college, I wouldn't say so. I've had no experience of that, but I do know experiences of it throughout the rest of the university, especially in like the anthropology department. I'm not involved in any of it, so I can't comment that much on it, but I have seen it crop up a few times in the past year. But I don't really have much of an experience.
No, I just wonder whether it was filtering into, you know, areas like yourself, because sadly it tends to be in our newspapers at least once a week. Other questions, please, from anyone before we let Erin get back to her busy studies.
Yeah, I've got another one, if I may. Have any of your lecturers gone on strike in the recent, and how do you feel about that? Having had the experience of all this online, you suddenly get the chance for in person and then they go on strike. Do you have sympathy with them, or is that just the last straw as far as you're concerned?
Obviously I have sympathy with them. They have to strike. It's their right to strike. So if it has to be done, it has to be done. I'm not going to complain about it. So for instance, I don't have any art history tutorials, where I won't have them for 4 weeks. I guess it's kind of annoying in a way. You've had your whole first year online, you're finally in person, and then suddenly you're not. So I haven't really had anything for the past couple of weeks. I'm on reading week right now, luckily. But I don't know, because on the one hand, it's nice to be back in person, and it's annoying when suddenly you're not doing anything again. But obviously I'm sympathetic towards it, and yeah.
If I just say, I think you're very generous. Yeah, incredibly. No, but that's I think that's your generation. You're much more generous than we are. All right.
Yes, people like Peter and I were a bit more impatient than you would
be,
and
remain so. I can tell you.
And unimpressed. Erin, we'll let you get back. Peter, I'll give you a vote of thanks, but can I just thank everybody else for joining us today. Last opportunity for a question for anybody. Are there any raised hands? If not, Peter, would you like to give a vote of thanks?
Well, I mean, this has just been such a lovely half hour. And for me personally, I have 2 daughters still at university, and these are the sort of questions I'm not allowed to ask them. So I'm so delighted I had you there, because I get some good solid answers, which was really good. But also, just as Martin said as well, I mean, we very much see you as part of the extended St Cuthbert's family, having been involved with us as you have been, you know, and as he said, please do keep on engaging with us. And if there's any way we can continue to help and support you going forward, please don't hesitate to ask. But thank you for a really insightful half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And just to add to that, we had a discussion in our Kirk session, the people who run St Cuthbert's on Tuesday night, about the concept of what is a congregation, which is an old-fashioned church word, and it used to apply really just to the immediate worshippers, but this is meant to be a compliment. We see you as part of the congregation of St Cuthbert's. That doesn't mean to say you've got to be there on a Sunday morning, but you're someone that we've got to know, you've got to know us, and it's just a joy to have met and to hear your work. And as we've made perfectly clear on this call, do use our facilities and come and join in whatever aspect that your art and photography work might benefit from being part of our congregation. So many thanks to you, and many thanks to everybody
very much
joining us today. God bless you all.